I quietly moved our retirement deposits into a new account and left the old one almost empty. The next morning, my son stormed into my kitchen, grabbed my shirt, and yelled, "Dad, you're ruining my life!" His wife started searching through my drawers like she owned my home. I didn't argue. I just smiled and let them believe they had won. But 1 hour later, everything changed. They never expected what happened next. Welcome to Dad's Revenge Stories. I'm so grateful you're here. Where are you watching from today? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Also, please note, this story includes fictional elements crafted for entertainment and valuable lessons. Any resemblance to names or places is purely coincidental, but the core message remains deeply meaningful. It wasn't a knock. I want to be precise about that, because it ended up mattering more than I expected. I was on my second cup of coffee, standing at the kitchen counter, watching the frost melt off the back window the way it does every November morning in Columbus. The house was quiet. Dot was still getting dressed down the hall. Everything was ordinary. And then the front door shook. Not a knock. 3 hard hits with something flat and heavy against the wood. Then a fourth, and the whole frame rattled in a way that a fist never makes. I knew that sound. I'd hung that door myself back in 2009, spent a whole Saturday fitting it right. And I knew immediately that whatever was on the other side of it wasn't a person who wanted to come in politely. I set my coffee mug down. My hand was steadier than I expected. Through the side window, I could see them. Travis was on the porch, his face pulled tight with something that had gone past anger into something uglier. Behind him, halfway down the front walk, was Kristen, both hands clenched at her sides, her voice already going before I even touched the door handle. I opened it. Travis shoved past me before I could say a word, right into the front room, his shoulder catching mine as he came through. He spun around, and his eyes were wild, the kind of wild I hadn't seen on his face since he was 4 years old and couldn't find his baseball glove. "Where is it?" he demanded. His voice cracked on the last word. "Where did you put it, Dad?" "Where did I put what, Travis?" "Don't." He pointed a finger at me and his whole arm was shaking. "Don't play dumb with me, the account. It's empty. What did you do with the money?" My chest ached so deeply I almost pressed my hand against it. This was my son, my boy who used to fall asleep in the truck on the way home from job sites, his head against the window, his baseball cap sliding down over his eyes. And now he was standing in my living room, shaking with rage over money that was never his to begin with. Kristen came in behind him and didn't stop in the front room. She walked straight through toward the kitchen. I heard a drawer open, then another one. She was going through Dot's kitchen drawers like she had every right in the world to be doing it. "You have destroyed us." Kristen's voice came from the kitchen, high and sharp as broken glass. "Do you understand what you've done? Our mortgage payment bounced. Travis's car payment bounced. You did this to us." "Yes, and what we did," I said. And I kept my voice level because I had been practicing keeping it level for 4 days. "Say that again, Kristen." "What we did." Travis came at me fast, both hands going to my shoulders before I could step back, driving me into the wall hard enough that something rattled behind me. His face was close enough that I could hear his breathing, ragged and fast, the breathing of a man who had been wound up for 4 days straight. "You are going to call the bank right now," he said through his teeth. "Right now, Dad. You are going to fix this." I was 69 years old, and my son had his hands on me in my own home. Every instinct I had wanted to push back. Every single one. But something stopped me, not strength, not calculation. Just the knowledge that there was a camera above the door, and that the moment I raised a hand, a lawyer somewhere would call this a family dispute and walk away from it. So I held still. I found a spot on the wall past his shoulder, and I fixed my eyes on it, and I did not move. Dot's voice came from the hallway, calm and clear as a bell. "Travis, take your hands off your father." Kristen came out of the kitchen. "Don't talk to him like that." Dot looked at Kristen the way a woman looks at something she has already figured out completely. "Kristen, those are my drawers you were going through. And that is my husband you're watching your husband put against a wall." She stepped forward. "And the camera above the front door has been recording since Tuesday." Travis went absolutely rigid. I felt it in his hands before I saw it on his face. He turned his head slowly and looked up at the transom above the door. The small black lens of the doorbell camera looked right back at him. His hands dropped off my shoulders like I'd burned him. He stumbled back 2 steps, his face going through 4 different expressions in about 3 seconds. "You recorded us?" Kristen's voice had gone from furious to something thin and afraid. "That's illegal. It's a doorbell camera on our own property," Dot said. "Completely legal in the state of Ohio." Outside, a neighbor had called 911. Officer Sandra Briggs arrived 6 minutes later in a patrol car. Travis was still arguing when she walked up the porch steps, his voice cracking apart at the edges. Kristen was talking over him, trying to explain that Gary had provoked them by cutting off their finances without warning. Officer Briggs listened carefully to both sides. She reviewed the doorbell camera footage, documented what happened, and asked Travis and Kristen a series of questions. After seeing the footage and determining that the situation had escalated beyond a simple family argument, she decided to take them into custody while the incident was investigated further. And Mason was standing on the sidewalk alone, 8 years old. His sneakers wet from the frost on the grass, tears streaming down his face, watching his parents get put in the back of a police car. I walked out there. I got down on one knee on that cold concrete, and I put my arms around that boy, and he grabbed onto my jacket with both fists and sobbed into my shoulder. His whole little body shook with it. "Grandpa," he choked out, "is Daddy going to be okay?" My throat closed completely. I held him tighter, and I pressed my eyes shut, and I did not have a single word to give him. Not one. Standing there on my knees on that frozen sidewalk holding my grandson, I kept turning the same question over in my head. How did we get here? And the answer didn't start that morning. It didn't start last year. It started a long time ago with a boy who used to ride shotgun in my work truck and ask me about pipe fittings all the way to the job site and back. Let me take you back. Not to last month. Not to last year. Further than that. I started working plumbing in 1978 when I was 24 years old and didn't know enough to be scared of anything. 36 years I spent under sinks in crawl spaces, knee-deep in job sites across Columbus. My hands looked like a topographical map by the time I retired, every knuckle a little off-center, every palm crossed with lines that no amount of lotion was ever going to fix. Dot used to hold my hand at church and joke that she was the only woman in the pew holding hands with a man whose palms felt like a hardware store floor. I didn't mind. I was proud of those hands. They put food on the table, put Travis through school, put a roof over our heads that never leaked, because I made sure of it personally. Travis came along in 1983, and from the time that boy could talk, he had questions about everything. Why does water go down and not up? What happens inside the pipes? How does the pressure know where to go? I'd be driving to a Saturday job, and he'd be in the passenger seat. Couldn't have been more than 9 or 10 firing questions at me the whole 40 minutes. Like I was the most interesting man alive. I loved every single one of those mornings. I want to say that plainly because none of what came later erases it. I loved having that boy next to me in the cab of that truck. His baseball cap on sideways, a gas station donut in his hand, asking me why copper pipe costs more than PVC. I'd answer every question, every one. Because copper lasts, Travis. Cheap stuff looks fine until it doesn't. Then it floods your basement at 2 in the morning. He'd nod like I'd handed him something valuable. And I suppose I had. Dot ran the house the way she ran everything, with complete precision and zero fanfare. 28 years as a school treasurer will do that to a person. She tracked every bill, every receipt, every grocery run in a little notebook she kept in the kitchen drawer. I used to tease her about it. Dot, we're not running a Fortune 500 company here. She'd look up from her notebook with that particular expression. She has the one that means she finds me charming, but is not going to tell me so, and say, somebody has to keep track, Gary. She was right. She was usually right. That's the part I didn't fully appreciate until much later. Travis grew up good. He really did. He was the kind of kid who shoveled Mrs. Patterson's driveway next door without being asked who called on Sunday evenings, just to check in who showed up, to help me reshingle the garage roof one August, and worked a full 8 hours without a single complaint. I watched him become a man, and I thought we did okay. Dot and we did okay with this one. Then he met Kristen. It was 2013. He brought her to Sunday dinner, and she was pretty and confident and laughed at all the right moments. Dot passed the rolls and smiled and asked Kristen about her family. Kristen said her mother was on her own, didn't have much, had worked hard her whole life. I liked that. I respected that. Driving home that night, Travis had taken Kristen back to her apartment. Dot sat in the passenger seat and looked out the window for a while. Then she said, "She's polished." "Is that bad?" I asked. "I didn't say bad," Dot said. "I said polished." She turned back to the window. There's a difference between someone who grew up with manners and someone who learned them for specific occasions. Dot, he just met her. I know. She smoothed her skirt over her knees. I'm just telling you what I noticed. I didn't say anything to that. Dot had a way of noticing things that took me considerably longer to see, and I'd learned over 40 years of marriage that the best response was usually to let her observation sit and wait for the world to prove her right or wrong. She had a better track record than I like to admit. 2 years later, Travis called on a Tuesday evening, his voice bright and nervous in the particular way of a man who has already made up his mind and is hoping the person he's calling will just go along with it. "Dad," he said, "I asked Kristen to marry me." She said yes. I felt my chest fill up with something warm and genuine. I called Dot in from the other room and held the phone out so she could hear, and she pressed her hand over her mouth, and her eyes went bright. It was one of those moments you tuck away carefully because you know it doesn't come back. "We're so happy for you, son," I told him, and I was. God help me, I was. That happiness was the most expensive feeling I ever had. But standing in my kitchen that Tuesday evening, with Dot's hand on my arm and Travis's voice coming through the phone, I didn't know that yet. I just knew my son was happy, and it felt like everything I'd worked 36 years for had been worth it. I didn't hear Dot later that night sitting at the kitchen table with her notebook open, writing something down in her careful, precise handwriting. I should have asked what it was. The engagement lasted 8 months. Long enough for Dot to learn Kristen's coffee order, long enough for me to fix the leaking faucet in Kristen's apartment twice without being asked, and long enough for Travis to sit down at my kitchen table one Sunday afternoon with a look on his face. I recognized immediately the look of a man who needs something and has already decided how to ask for it. "Dad," he said, wrapping both hands around his coffee mug, "I need to talk to you about the wedding. I put the newspaper down." "Okay." "Kristen's mom, you know her situation. She's on her own. She doesn't have a lot." He looked up at me and his eyes were earnest and a little pained the way they used to get when he was a teenager asking to borrow the truck. I don't want Kristen to have a small wedding because her family can't contribute. She deserves better than that. My chest pulled tight with something that felt like love and pride all wrapped together. My son worried about his future wife's dignity. I thought, this is the man I raised. How much are we talking? I asked. 18,000. Maybe a little under if we're careful. I nodded. I didn't hesitate. Dot was standing in the doorway with a dish towel in her hands, and I looked over at her, and she gave me one small, careful nod. So I said yes. What I found out later, much later after everything else, was that Kristen's mother, a woman named Carol, owned a 3-bedroom house outright in Westerville, drove a 2-year-old Buick, and had been retired comfortably for 6 years on a pension from the county school district. She was not by any definition of the word a woman without resources. But I didn't know that on that Sunday afternoon. I just knew my son was asking, and I said yes. The wedding was beautiful. I'll give it that. October at a venue out past Gahanna with white lights in the trees and a band that played until 11. Dot cried during the ceremony, happy tears dabbing at her eyes with a tissue she'd tucked into her wristlet. I stood next to Travis at the altar and thought, this is what all those early mornings were for. All those crawl spaces and cold job sites and 14-hour days. This right here. And then I met Carol. She walked in wearing a dress that cost more than my first truck, carrying herself with the easy confidence of a woman who had never in her life described herself as struggling. She shook my hand warmly, told me the venue was lovely, and spent the reception holding court at a table near the dance floor, like she'd organized the whole thing herself. I leaned over to Dot during the first dance and said quietly, I thought you said she was on her own. Dot looked at Carol across the room. I never said that. Travis did. I sat with that for a moment. Then the music swelled, and Travis spun Kristen under the lights, and I let it go. It was their wedding day. I was not going to let a misunderstanding about Carol's finances put a shadow on it. That was the second time I made an excuse. I was getting faster at it. 3 months after the wedding, Travis called on a Thursday evening. He and Kristen had found a house they loved in Hilliard, good neighborhood, good school district, good bones. But they were short on the down payment. $27,000 short. Dad, I know it's a lot, he said. But this is the one. Kristen cried when she walked through it. I don't want to lose it. Dot was sitting at the kitchen table when I told her. She set her pen down on her notebook and looked at me for a long moment, her eyes steady and measuring. Gary, she said, we are not a bank. It's our son, Dot. It's $27,000. He'll pay us back when they're on their feet. Dot picked her pen back up. She didn't argue further. She just wrote something in that notebook of hers, slow and deliberate. And I didn't ask what it was. I transferred the money the next morning. 2 weeks later, Travis called to say they'd gotten the keys. He sounded genuinely happy, the kind of happy that's hard to fake, and I felt the warmth of it even through the phone. Then he said, Hey Dad, the place needs some work before we move in. You think you could come take a look? I came and took a look. I ended up staying 3 weeks. Every morning I drove over with my truck bed full of supplies, paint rollers, brushes, caulk, sandpaper, and I worked room by room through that house while Travis was at work. I painted the living room, the hallway, both bedrooms, the kitchen. I re-caulked the bathroom, fixed a sticky window in the master bedroom, replaced the weather stripping on the back door. Dot came by one afternoon toward the end and stood in the doorway watching me roll paint onto the last wall in the guest room. She didn't say anything critical. She just handed me a bottle of water, looked around at the fresh walls and said, It looks good, Gary. On the last day, I climbed down off the stepladder, and my lower back screamed at me the whole way down. Travis came home from work just as I was loading my supplies back into the truck. He walked up the front path, looked at the house, and said, "Looks great, Dad." Then he went inside. "Not thank you, Dad. Not I don't know how to repay you for this. Just looks great," and a door closing behind him. I stood at my truck for a moment, with my hand on the tailgate, my back aching, paint on my forearms, and I thought about those mornings in the work truck when he was 9 years old, asking me about pipe fittings. That boy had looked at me like I knew everything worth knowing. I told myself he was tired. He'd had a long day. He didn't mean anything by it. I told myself that. I drove home. I didn't mention it to Dot, but somewhere in the back of my mind, in a place I wasn't ready to look at, yet something had shifted. Small as a hairline crack in a pipe. The kind you don't notice until the water starts coming through. Mason Gerald Sutton came into the world on a Tuesday morning in April of 2016, 7 pounds and 4 ounces, with a full head of dark hair and a set of lungs that, according to the nurse, could be heard from the end of the maternity hallway. I cried in that hospital corridor. I want to put that on the record. 62 years old, a man who had not cried at his own father's funeral because he was too busy holding his mother up. And I stood outside that delivery room door, and my eyes filled up, and there wasn't a thing I could do about it. Dot found me like that. She took one look, pressed her lips together to keep from smiling, and handed me a paper towel from the bathroom. "Pull it together, Gary," she said, but her own voice was doing something unsteady around the edges, so I didn't take the instruction too seriously. They let us in a few minutes later. Travis was sitting on the edge of the bed next to Kristen, and he was holding this small, red-faced, outraged-looking baby, like he was holding something made of glass and lightning at the same time. He looked up at me when I walked in, and his face was completely undone, every wall, down every cool thing he'd learned to do, with his expression gone. And he said, "Dad, look." Just that. Look. I looked, and I understood everything he meant by it. Mason grew fast, the way kids do when you're not watching closely enough. 1 month he couldn't hold his own head up. Then somehow it was his first birthday, then his second, and suddenly there was a small person in my house every Sunday who called me Grandpa and climbed onto my lap like I was a piece of furniture specifically designed for that purpose. That boy loved tools. 4 years old, and he'd drag my toolbox out from under the bathroom sink and line everything up on the kitchen floor in a row, biggest to smallest, and then look up at me with enormous satisfaction, like he'd accomplished something significant. "Good job, buddy," I'd tell him. "I sorted them, Grandpa," he'd say, completely serious. "I see that. You want to learn what each one does." His face would light up so fast it almost hurt to look at. Those Sunday mornings with Mason were the best part of my week. I want to say that clearly. Whatever was quietly going wrong with Travis and Kristen during those years, Mason was never part of it. He was just a kid who loved his grandfather, and I loved him back with everything I had. Then came the winter he turned 3. Travis called at 1:30 in the morning. The phone rang me out of a dead sleep, and I grabbed it off the nightstand before the second ring, the way you do when you're a parent, and you've never fully stopped being on call. "Dad." Travis's voice was high and tight, wound up with fear. "Mason's sick. Like really sick. He's burning up, and he's breathing weird, and Kristen's scared, and I don't know what to do." I was out of bed before he finished the sentence. Dot sat up and said, "What is it?" And I said, "Mason," and she was up too, reaching for her robe. "Take him to Nationwide Children's," I said into the phone, already pulling on my jeans. "I'll meet you there." "Dad, it's 1:30. "I'll meet you there, Travis." I drove through empty streets with the heater blasting, and my hands tight on the wheel, running every red light. I felt confident running. Nationwide Children's Hospital on Livingston Avenue. I'd driven past it 100 times without ever needing it, and now the parking lot felt like the most important place in the world. They had Mason in a room by the time I got there. Viral pneumonia, the doctor said. Serious enough that they wanted to keep him for observation, start him on antibiotics, monitor his oxygen levels through the night. Travis stood in the hallway outside the room with his arms crossed tight over his chest, his face the color of old concrete, and Kristen sat inside with Mason holding his small hand while he slept with a pulse ox monitor clipped to his finger. I sat in a plastic chair in that hallway and I stayed. Travis fell asleep in the chair beside me around 3 in the morning, his head dropping to his chest. Kristen's sister came and took Kristen home around 4 to get a few hours of rest, and I sat there alone in that corridor with a cup of terrible vending machine coffee and watched the numbers on the monitor through the window in the door, and I prayed the way a man prays when the only thing standing between him and complete panic is the act of talking to God. 7 o'clock came. Mason's fever had broken. The doctor came out and said the numbers looked better and they were cautiously optimistic, and I shook that man's hand so hard he probably still remembers it. I drove straight to a job site from the hospital. Didn't go home, didn't change clothes. Showed up in the same flannel shirt I'd slept in, smelling like hospital coffee, and worked a full 8 hours because I had a commitment, and I honored it. The bill came to $3,400. Travis called me 3 days later, voice apologetic and thin, and said the insurance had gaps he hadn't realized were there, and the card had been declined at the billing window. "Don't worry about it," I said. I called the hospital and paid it over the phone that afternoon. Travis didn't bring it up again. Not once. Not a week later, not a month later, not ever. I told myself he was embarrassed. I told myself he'd pay me back when things evened out. I was good at telling myself things in those days. What I didn't know was that Dot had already opened her notebook and written down $3,400 in her careful, even handwriting, right below everything else she'd been quietly tracking. She didn't tell me. She didn't need to. She was building something. I just didn't know what it was yet. Nobody warns you about the way it starts. That's the thing I keep coming back to even now. People hear a story like mine and they picture a moment, one clear, obvious moment where a man should have seen what was happening and put his foot down. They picture a door slamming or a number so large it stops your heart, or a look on somebody's face that tells you everything you need to know. It doesn't start that way. It starts with something that makes you feel needed. Something so small and so reasonable that refusing it would make you the problem. It was February of 2022. Travis called on a Sunday afternoon, his voice carrying that particular tired quality of a man who's been up since 6 with a 6-year-old and hasn't had a moment to himself since. "Dad, I hate to ask," he said, "but we're running a little short this week. Groceries mainly. Nothing crazy. Things are tight right now." I said, of course. Transferred $300 before I hung up the phone. Dot was at the kitchen table when I told her. She looked up from whatever she was reading, studied my face for a second, then nodded once, and went back to her page. She didn't say a word. At the time, I thought she was fine with it. She was writing it down. I just didn't know that yet. The next month, Travis didn't call. I thought good they got back on their feet. Then, on a Thursday afternoon, my phone buzzed with a text from Kristen. Not Travis, not even addressed to me. It was sent to Dot. "Hey Mom, we're a little short again this week. If you guys can help, that would be amazing, no pressure." Like it was the most natural thing in the world. Like asking had already become a normal part of the calendar. Dot showed me the message without comment. I transferred $300 and didn't say anything about the fact that Kristen had bypassed Travis entirely and gone straight to Dot. That became the rhythm. Some months Travis called. Some months Kristen texted. Some months nothing came, and I'd feel a small embarrassing sense of relief, like maybe it was over, like maybe they'd figured things out. And then the next month the text would come again, and the relief would dissolve, and I'd transfer the money and tell myself it was fine. Then Kristen found a more effective method. I was in the garage on a Saturday afternoon cleaning out my toolbox when I heard small feet on the driveway. I looked up, and Mason was standing at the garage door in his sneakers, still in his pajama shirt. His eyes big and earnest and a little uncertain, the way a child looks when an adult has sent him to do something he doesn't fully understand. "Grandpa," he said, "Mommy said we don't have food today." My heart cracked clean in half. Not broke, cracked. The way a good piece of wood cracks when you put too much stress on the grain. I put my wrench down and I crouched down to his level and I said, "Well, we can't have that, can we, buddy?" He shook his head very seriously. I drove him to the grocery store myself. Let him pick out his cereal, the brand with the cartoon on the box, and a box of those crackers he liked, and some apples, because Dot always said fruit first. I carried the bags inside their house and set them on the counter, and Kristen came out of the back hallway and said, "Oh, thank you, Gary," in a warm voice, and then she looked into the bags and said, "Oh, we usually get the other bread, the whole wheat one." She said it the way you'd say it to a waiter who'd brought the wrong side dish. I drove home with my hands tight on the steering wheel, my jaw working on something I didn't say out loud. When I got back, Dot was on the porch with her coffee. She looked at my face and said, "What happened?" I told her about the bread. Dot set her coffee mug down on the porch railing very carefully, the way she does when she's making sure her hands stay occupied, so they don't do anything else. She looked out at the street for a moment, then turned back to me and said, Gary, watch how she looks at the house when they come over. Really watch." "She's just comfortable around us now," I said. "That's a good thing." Dot looked at me with those steady, patient eyes she's had since the day I met her. "Okay," she said. That okay landed differently than her other okays. It had weight to it. It had history. 40 years of marriage had taught me that when Dot said okay, in that particular register, she wasn't agreeing with me. She was deciding to wait. She was giving the world time to prove its case because she already knew what the verdict was going to be. I told myself I was reading too much into a word. I went inside and made myself a sandwich and turned on the game, and I sat in my chair and tried not to think about a 6-year-old boy walking down the driveway alone in his pajama shirt to ask his grandfather for food. What I didn't let myself think about, not yet, not that afternoon, was that Mason hadn't come on his own. Mason was 6. A 6-year-old doesn't decide to walk to Grandpa's house alone to ask for groceries. A 6-year-old does what he's told. Someone had sent that boy to my door, knowing full well I would not be able to say no to his face. And they were right. I couldn't. I never could. I just wasn't ready yet to look directly at what that meant. There's a moment in every slow disaster when the thing that's been creeping toward you picks up speed. You don't always notice it when it happens. You notice it later when you're looking back and you think there. Right there. That's when the slope got steeper. For us, it was the sofa. Travis called on a Saturday morning in the spring of 2022, bright and casual the way he called when he wanted something, but hadn't decided how to ask yet. "Hey Dad, Kristen and I are going to look at some furniture today. You want to come along, make a day of it, bring Dot?" It sounded like an invitation, a family afternoon. Nothing wrong with that. We met them at a furniture store out on West Broad Street, the kind of place with showroom floors the size of a football field, and salespeople in khakis who appear from nowhere the second you slow down to look at anything. Travis and Kristen moved through that store like they'd already decided before they walked in. They went straight to a sectional sofa in the back, dove gray oversized, the kind you see in a magazine spread about how young couples live in the Midwest. Travis dropped onto one cushion and spread his arms wide. "What do you think, Dad? Pretty great, right?" "It's a nice sofa," I said. Kristen was already reading the tag. "It's $2,100, she said, in the tone of a person announcing a price they've already mentally paid. The salesman appeared. He looked at our little group, me and Travis and Kristen Mason, running his hand along the armrest, and asked who he should write the ticket up for. Travis turned to me. He smiled. Not the nervous smile of a man about to ask for something. The comfortable smile of a man who already knows the answer. "Dad's got it," he said. He said it to the salesman, not to me. He announced it to a stranger in khakis about my money without asking me a single word. I took out my credit card. My face stayed neutral. Dot's hand found my arm briefly, just a light pressure through my jacket sleeve, and then she let go. The sofa was the first of many. 6 weeks later, it was a refrigerator. The old one was making a noise, Travis said, and they'd found a good deal at the Sears outlet in Hilliard, $1,400. And could I come take a look? I came and took a look, and somehow left having paid for it. Then a washing machine, $900. Travis's current one had started shaking so bad it walked across the laundry room floor. Then a television for the bedroom, $650, because Mason needed better educational programming, Kristen explained, and the picture quality on the old one was poor. Each time the same process. The invitation that was really a setup, the casual arrival at the register, the moment when Travis would look at me with that easy, practiced smile and say some version of "Dad's got it." I paid. Every time. Then one evening in the fall of 2022, Travis sat down at my kitchen table and said he wanted to help me get set up with online banking. "Dad, you're still doing everything by phone and paper checks," he said, shaking his head like this was a genuine concern. "It's not safe. Scammers target people who don't have their accounts set up digitally. Let me show you how." I thought he was being a good son. He spent an hour at my kitchen table walking me through the bank's app on my phone. How to check balances, how to review statements, how to set up notifications. Patient, thorough, explaining every step. And at some point during that hour, without making a production of it, he added his own login credentials to the account under a feature called Linked Family Access. It was a feature the bank offered for exactly this kind of situation, an adult child helping manage an aging parent's finances. Travis explained it briefly, called it a convenience feature, said it just meant he could check in and make sure things were running smoothly if I ever had a question. I said that sounded practical. I said thank you. What I did not understand, what I did not find out until much, much later, was that linked family access did not just mean Travis could view my account. It meant he could initiate transfers. Small ones, the kind that don't trigger the bank's automatic fraud alerts. The kind that look on a statement like routine bill payments or subscription charges. The kind Dot would eventually find with a yellow highlighter. I didn't know any of that in the fall of 2022. I just knew my son had spent an evening helping me figure out my phone, and I'd gone to bed feeling like maybe things between us were turning a corner. Like maybe the sofa and the refrigerator and the washing machine were bumps, not a pattern. Dot was quieter than usual that night. She sat at the kitchen table after Travis left her notebook open, her pen moving in that slow, deliberate way she has when she's working something out on paper. "He's good with technology," I offered. Dot looked up. Her eyes held something I couldn't quite read. Not anger, not fear, but something careful and wide awake. "Yes," she said. "He is." She looked back down at her notebook. I went to bed. She stayed at that table for another hour, and I heard her pen moving in the quiet house, writing things down in her careful, even hand, building something I couldn't see yet from the inside. It was Kristen's idea. It's always worth noting whose idea something is, because by the time the bill arrives, the person with the idea has usually found somewhere else to stand. She brought it up in May at Sunday dinner, at our house. Dot's pot roast Mason, eating everything on his plate because he actually liked vegetables at that age, Travis working on his second helping. Kristen set her fork down and said, "You know what? Mason has never seen the ocean. I think every kid should see the ocean before they're 10. I looked at Mason. He looked back at me with absolutely enormous eyes. "The ocean," he said like it was a word from another language. "Florida would be perfect." Kristen continued smoothing her napkin across her lap. There are some beautiful family resorts on the Gulf side. Very reasonable in June before the peak season hits. Travis nodded along. "It would be great for Mason, Dad. Kid his age, the memories alone." "How much?" Dot asked. She said it pleasantly, the way she asks most things, but she set her fork down too, and I noticed that. Kristen pulled out her phone and read off some numbers she had clearly already looked up. Flights out of Port Columbus a week at a Gulf-side resort, meals, activities. For the 5 of us, her, Travis, Mason, me and Dot, she had it priced at somewhere around $6,800. I looked at Dot. Dot looked at me. Something passed between us in that look that I didn't examine closely enough. "We'll take care of it," I said. Mason made a sound, like a small animal discovering it had won something enormous, and threw both arms around my neck from across the corner of the table, nearly knocking my water glass over. His hair smelled like the shampoo Dot kept in the guest bathroom for when he stayed over. I held on to him and thought, this is what it's for. We booked it the following week. Dot handled the arrangements, flights, resort transfers with the quiet efficiency she brings to everything. I signed the credit card statements without looking too hard at the running total. The Wednesday before we were supposed to leave, Kristen sent Dot a text message. I was in the garage when Dot came to the door and read it to me, her voice perfectly even. She says her mother would love to join us. She's already looked at flights. There's one that lands 40 minutes after ours. I put down the wrench I was holding. Carol. Carol, Dot confirmed. She's already looked at flights, I repeated. That's what it says. I stood there in my garage looking at the pegboard where my tools hang in their outlines, each one traced in black marker, so I always know what goes where, and I felt something move through my chest that I didn't have a clean name for. It wasn't quite anger. It was closer to the feeling you get when you realize a door you thought was open for you was actually being held open for somebody else. I booked Carol's flight and added a room to the reservation. $6,800 became just over $8,000. Dot said nothing about it. Not one word. She just updated the notebook. The trip itself was genuinely beautiful. I want to be fair about that. The Gulf water was the color of green glass, and the sand was so white it hurt to look at in the afternoon sun, and Mason ran into the waves for the first time in his life, and came up sputtering and laughing with his whole body, his arms out wide, like he was trying to hold on to the feeling of it. I stood at the waterline and watched him and felt something so clean and uncomplicated. It almost made me forget everything else. Almost. Carol spent the week in the lounge chair next to Kristen, ordering drinks with little paper umbrellas, talking about things I couldn't hear from where I sat with Mason in the shallow water. She was perfectly pleasant to me when we were at the dinner table together. She called me Gary and laughed at my jokes and complimented Dot's sundress on the second evening. But I noticed at every meal that when the check arrived, Carol's eyes went somewhere else. To the horizon, to her phone, to something fascinating on the far side of the restaurant. And Travis would say quiet and easy as breathing, "Dad's got it." On the last evening, Dot and I sat on the balcony of our room after Mason had gone to sleep on the pullout in the living area. The gulf was black beyond the resort lights, and somewhere out in that darkness, the water was moving, and you could hear it without seeing it. Dot had her coffee and I had mine, and for a while we just sat with the sound of it. Then Dot said, "Gary, when's the last time we went somewhere, just the two of us?" The question hit me somewhere behind the sternum. I thought about it seriously, running backward through the years, looking for a trip that was just ours. The last one I could find was a long weekend in Gatlinburg, Tennessee, in the fall of 2019, 3 years ago. Before the grocery transfers started, before the sofa and the refrigerator and the washing machine, before Mason's hospital bill. "Gatlinburg," I said. "2019, Dot nodded. She wrapped both hands around her coffee mug and looked out at the black water. 4 years, she said quietly. "We'll do something," I told her. "Just us. Soon." Dot turned and looked at me, and her eyes were soft, but there was something else in them too. Something tired and awake at the same time. The look of a woman who has been patient for a very long time and is beginning to calculate exactly how much patience she has left. "Okay, Gary," she said. I heard it. That okay? The same one from the porch, the same one from the kitchen, the same register, and the same weight. I heard it, and I felt it land, and I looked back out at the water, and I told myself it just meant she was tired from the trip. I was getting very good at telling myself things. After Florida, they started taking space. Money is one thing. You hand it over, it's gone. You feel it in the account and in your chest, and you move on. Space is different. Space is the coffee you made for 2 people, and suddenly there are 5. Space is your wife's kitchen being used by someone else's hands on a Tuesday morning when you thought it was going to be a quiet day. Space gets into everything, and it doesn't leave a clean edge you can point to. The first Saturday it happened, I thought it was a nice surprise. It was early October of 2023, cool enough that the leaves on the maple out front had started turning, and I was on my second cup of coffee at the kitchen table with the sports section when I heard a key in the front door. Not a knock. A key. Travis still had the copy I'd made him 2 years earlier when Dot and I went to Cincinnati for a long weekend and asked him to check on the house. He came in first, then Kristen behind him with a tote bag, then Mason in his weekend sneakers running straight past both of them to find me. "Grandpa." He hit me around the midsection like a small freight train. I laughed and hugged him back and looked up at Travis over the top of his head. "Morning," I said. "Everything okay?" "Everything's great," Travis said, already moving toward the kitchen. "We were up early, thought we'd come by make some breakfast." "That okay?" Kristen was already opening the refrigerator. I said, "Of course." Because Mason was grinning at me with maple syrup ambitions in his eyes, and because Dot came down the hallway in her robe and lit up when she saw him, and because what kind of man says no to that on a Saturday morning? Dot made eggs and I made toast, and Kristen stood at our stove scrambling more eggs in Dot's good pan, the one Dot has had since 1987, and handles like it's a living thing. Mason ate enough for a person twice his size and talked without stopping about something that had happened at school involving a frog and a fire drill, and honestly, it was a good morning. They came back the next Saturday, and the one after that. By November, it was every weekend without exception, and sometimes Wednesday evenings too, and occasionally a Monday afternoon when Kristen said she had the day off and Mason didn't have school. They never called ahead. They had a key and they used it, and after a while Dot started making enough breakfast for 5 people automatically, the way you adjust to a new normal without deciding to. I noticed things I didn't say out loud. I noticed that Travis never brought anything, not a carton of orange juice, not a bag of bagels, not a box of the cereal Mason liked. I noticed that Kristen used Dot's good pan without asking and put it in the dish rack without seasoning it afterward the way Dot always did. I noticed that the conversations at the table were mostly Mason talking and Kristen talking and Travis talking, and that Dot would smile and respond and pour more coffee, and that at no point did anyone ask Dot how she was doing or whether this Saturday worked for her. I noticed all of it, and I said none of it. I told myself it was family. I told myself this was what having grandchildren felt like, loud and unpredictable and exhausting, in a way that is also secretly wonderful. Then Travis started calling about the house. The first call was a Tuesday evening in late October. "Dad, the bathroom faucet is dripping again," he said. "I know you're busy, but if you get a chance." I was over there the next morning with my toolbox. The faucet took 40 minutes. I showed myself out. 3 weeks later, it was a light fixture in the garage that had stopped working. Then a sticky door on the back porch that wouldn't latch properly in cold weather. Then the kitchen drain was slow. Then there were boxes in the garage from when they'd moved in that needed to be shifted, because Kristen wanted to park inside for the winter, and Travis said his back had been giving him trouble and could I come help move things around. I helped move things around. I kept a count in my head, without meaning to the way you count things when you're a tradesman, and every job has a number attached to it. By February of 2024, I had made 11 separate trips to Travis and Kristen's house to fix or haul or install or adjust something. I had not once been offered so much as a bottle of water while I worked. One evening, I was lying under their bathroom sink, replacing a supply line, a 20-minute job, not complicated, and I heard the television go on in the living room. Then I heard Travis settle into the couch with the particular creak that couch makes. I lay there on the cold tile floor under the sink, a flashlight in my teeth, and I thought about the sofa I had paid $2,100 for. I thought about how it was Travis sitting on it right now, while his 69-year-old father was on the floor in the next room. I finished the job. I packed my tools. Travis called from the couch, "Thanks, Dad, you're the best." And I said no problem, and let myself out. Driving home, my lower back burning from the cold tile, I passed 3 plumbing vans on the road. Licensed tradesmen charging honest rates for honest work. I had done the same work for 36 years and charged every customer the going rate and felt right about it every time. I could not tell you what I felt on that drive home. I just know it wasn't right. You find out the way you always find out things you weren't supposed to know. Not from a confrontation. Not from a document or a phone call or a moment of dramatic revelation. You find out sideways in a place you weren't expecting from someone who doesn't realize what they're handing you. For me, it was a hardware store on a Tuesday afternoon in January. I'd gone to Ace Hardware on Henderson Road to pick up a box of half-inch copper fittings. Old habit, I still do my own plumbing work around the house, and I ran into Dennis Kowalski, Ray's younger brother, a man I'd known since Travis was in Little League. Dennis was looking at PVC cement, and he turned around and saw me, and his face did something complicated for just a half second before it settled into a smile. "Gary," he said. "Hey, how are things?" "Fine," I said. "Good. How's the family?" "Good, good." He shifted the can of cement from one hand to the other. Then he said, "Hey, listen, I heard you and Travis have been going through some stuff. I just want you to know whatever's happening, people around here know what kind of man you are." I stood in the middle of that hardware store aisle with a box of copper fittings in my hand and felt the floor do something uncertain under my feet. "What kind of stuff did you hear?" I asked. Dennis looked uncomfortable. "Just you know. Things get around. Kristen's been talking to some people. Linda Marsh, a couple others, saying you've been making things hard for them financially. Controlling is the word she used." He shook his head. "I didn't believe it for a second, Gary. but I thought you should know." I thanked him. I paid for my fittings. I sat in my truck in the parking lot for 4 minutes without starting the engine. Linda Marsh had been our neighbor for 22 years. She lived in the yellow house directly across the street, the one with the blue shutters that her late husband Earl had painted the year before he passed. Linda brought us a casserole when Dot had her knee surgery in 2019. I shoveled her driveway 3 winters running when her hip was giving her trouble. We waved to each other every single morning across that street, and for the past several months, she had been walking past me like I was a stranger. I'd noticed it and told myself she was preoccupied. Grieving Earl, still maybe, or having her own health troubles. I'd told myself a lot of things. When I got home, Dot was in the kitchen starting dinner. I sat down at the table and told her what Dennis had said, and I watched her face while I talked. She didn't look surprised. She didn't look hurt. She looked like a woman hearing confirmation of something she had already figured out on her own. "How long have you known?" I asked. Dot set down the wooden spoon she was holding and turned to face me fully. "I talked to Ruth Adelman about 2 months ago," she said. Ruth Adelman was the retired school teacher who lived in the brick house at the end of our block, a woman who had known us both since Mason was in diapers. Ruth told me that Travis and Kristen had been going to Linda's house for coffee pretty regularly, sitting at her kitchen table and telling her that you controlled their finances, that you made them ask permission for every dollar they spent, that they couldn't get ahead because of how you handled things. My jaw tightened so hard I felt it in my temples. And Linda believed that. Linda only heard one side. Dot said not excusing it, but explaining it the way she explains most things, without heat, without drama, just the fact of it laid out flat. Kristen also told her that I was cold with Mason, that I didn't show him much affection. Dot picked the spoon back up. That one bothered me more than the rest of it, honestly. It bothered me too. It bothered me in a place that didn't have words attached to it, somewhere below the level of language, because I had watched Dot love that boy since the day he was born. I had watched her sit on the floor and do puzzles with him for an hour when her knees hurt. I had watched her learn what his favorite sandwich was and keep the ingredients stocked without being asked. The idea of anyone, let alone Kristen, describing Dot as cold with Mason made something hot move through my chest that I had to breathe through carefully. "There's more," Dot said. She put dinner on low and sat down across from me. "Travis has been telling people at his work that we're wealthy but stingy, that they have to beg us for help, that we could do more but choose not to." She looked at me steadily. "He told that to at least 3 people who know people we know." It got back to Ruth through 2 different directions. I thought about the $300 I'd transferred the previous Thursday. I thought about the $8,000 I'd spent on a family vacation that included a woman I barely knew. I thought about 11 trips across town with my toolbox in the truck bed. And I thought about Christmas. Last December, Travis and Kristen had given Dot and me a box of cookies from the grocery store. The kind that come in a tin with a plastic tray inside, $8 on the clearance rack after Thanksgiving. I'd watched Kristen hand it to Dot with a warm smile and say, "We wanted to get you guys something," and Dot had said thank you and put it on the counter. The same Christmas, I had given Travis an envelope with $500 in it because he'd mentioned the heating bill was high. I hadn't thought about the disproportion of it until right then, sitting at my kitchen table in January, and when I did think about it, the feeling that moved through me wasn't anger. It was something quieter and colder. It was the feeling of a man who has just understood something he should have understood a long time ago and knows that the only person responsible for the delay is himself. "They've been doing this a while," I said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Dot said. "I think so." And the whole time they were sitting at our table every Saturday morning eating our food. Dot looked at me across the table, and her eyes were clear and direct, and full of something that was not quite sadness, but lived right next to it. "Gary," she said, "I need you to hear me when I say this. What is happening is not a misunderstanding. It is not a phase. It is a pattern. And I have been watching it long enough to be certain." My throat felt thick and wrong. I nodded. I didn't trust what would come out if I opened my mouth all the way. "Okay," I said finally. "What do we do?" Dot folded her hands on the table. "First," she said, "we find out exactly how bad it is. I have fixed thousands of things in my life. Pipes, fixtures, valves, pressure systems, water heaters that decided to quit in January. When something is broken, my instinct has always been the same: go look at it directly, figure out what's wrong, and fix it. Don't wait. Don't talk around it. Get your hands on the problem." So I drove to Travis's house on a Thursday afternoon in late January without calling ahead. I want to walk you through that conversation carefully, because it is the one I have replayed more than any other in this whole thing. More than the morning with the door. More than the courtroom. This one because it is the conversation where I had every piece of information I needed to act, and I walked away having done nothing. Travis answered the door in a t-shirt and jeans, holding a can of soda, and his face went through a quick flicker of something, surprise or adjustment, before it settled into an easy smile. "Dad. Hey. Come on in." I came in. I sat down in the living room on the dove gray sofa I had paid $2,100 for, and I looked at my son and I said, "I need to talk to you about some things I've been hearing." Travis sat down across from me and leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, his face open and attentive. He had always been good at that, at making you feel like he was fully present, fully listening, giving you his complete attention. I used to think that was a quality I'd taught him. Sit still. Look people in the eye. Be there when someone's talking to you. "What's going on?" he said. I told him what Dennis had said at the hardware store. I told him what Dot had heard from Ruth Adelman about the coffee visits to Linda Marsh. I kept my voice level, and I laid it out plainly because that's how I handle things. No theatrics, just the information. Travis listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he shook his head slowly, like a man genuinely saddened by what he was hearing. "Dad," he said, "I'm really sorry that got back to you that way. The truth is, Kristen vents sometimes. You know how it is when you're stressed, you say things to friends that you wouldn't necessarily say to the people involved. She didn't mean for it to sound the way Linda made it sound. She called me controlling," I said. "She was frustrated," Travis said. "That's different from meaning it. And honestly, Dad, Linda Marsh has been looking for drama since Earl died. You know that. She takes one thing and turns it into three." He leaned back and spread his hands. "I should have said something to Kristen about keeping private stuff private. That's on me. I'm sorry." He said all of it smoothly. No stumble, no pause in the wrong place. No moment where his eyes went somewhere else. And then he stood up and went to the kitchen and came back with a cold soda and held it out to me, and the gesture was so natural and so familiar, my son bringing his father a drink the way he'd done 100 times, that something in me wanted very badly to accept the can and accept the explanation and go home. I took the soda. I held it without opening it. "Travis," I said, "are things okay financially, I mean, between you and Kristen?" He smiled again, this time with something a little tired around the edges, the smile of a man who is carrying something heavy but managing. It's tight, he said. It's always tight. But we're okay, Dad. We're figuring it out. I looked at my son sitting across from me in his own living room. Comfortable, composed, a man in full possession of himself. And I thought, he looks fine. He sounds fine. Maybe Dennis caught it at a bad angle. Maybe Dot's right that it's a pattern, but maybe this is also just two young people under financial pressure doing what young people do, which is complain to their friends and have it come out worse than they meant. Kristen appeared from the hallway, then saw me and smiled the warm social smile she kept ready for situations that required it. Gary, I didn't know you were stopping by. Can I get you anything? I was just about to start dinner. He can't stay, Travis said and looked at me. Can you, Dad? I said no. I needed to get back. I said everything sounded fine and I was glad we talked. I shook Travis's hand at the door. Actually shook it the way you do with a man you've just resolved something with, and I walked to my truck and drove home. I got back to find Dot at the kitchen table with her notebook open, 3 different colored pens lined up beside it like surgical instruments. She looked up when I came in. How did it go? She asked. Fine, I said. He explained it. Kristen vents to her friends. Linda blew it up. Travis said he'd talk to her. Dot looked at me for a long moment. The kind of look that doesn't accuse you of anything, but makes you feel the full weight of what you just said. So he explained it, she said. Yeah. And you felt better afterward? I did, I said. And then I heard myself say it. And something about the sound of it, the ease of it, the relief in it, made me feel the first real tremor of doubt. Because I had gone over there with a problem and come back feeling better, and I had not actually seen a single piece of evidence that anything had changed. Dot nodded slowly. She picked up her pen. Okay, Gary, she said. She went back to the notebook. I stood in my kitchen doorway and watched her write, and for the first time, I didn't ask myself what she was writing down. For the first time, I found myself hoping she'd keep going. Because somewhere in the drive home, in the space between Travis's smooth explanation and my own front door, I had started to understand that my wife had been working on something for a very long time, and that whatever it was, I was going to need it. Before I tell you what was in that notebook, the full truth, every dollar drop, a 11 in the comments. I need to know you're still with me before I say this part. Some details in this story are fictionalized for storytelling purposes. If that changes things for you, I completely understand. 3 days after I came back from Travis's house, Dot said 4 words to me at the breakfast table. Gary, sit down. Please. I was standing at the counter pouring my second cup of coffee. I turned around and looked at her face and put the coffee pot back without pouring. In 43 years of marriage, Dot has never once asked me to sit down before delivering good news. Good news she just tells you standing up wherever she happens to be. It's only the other kind that requires a chair. I sat down. She set the notebook on the table between us. Not the little one I'd seen her writing in over the years. This was different. This was a full-sized composition notebook, the black and white kind, and it was thick with use, the spine bent, and the cover soft from handling. She'd had it for longer than I realized. I need to show you something, she said. And I need you to let me finish before you say anything. I nodded. She opened it to the first page and turned it toward me. Her handwriting filled every line, dates in the left margin, descriptions in the middle, dollar amounts, on the right underlined in red wherever the number was larger than the one before it. She had been doing this since before the groceries started. She had been doing this since the wedding. I kept track of everything, she said. Every transfer you made, every bill you paid, every cash amount. The down payment, the wedding, the hospital, the appliances, the trips, the restaurant bills, the grocery runs. All of it. Every time you fixed something at their house, I logged the hours and calculated what a licensed plumber charges in Columbus. She paused. I included that too. I looked down at the page. The columns were perfectly even. The handwriting never wavered. Dot. Let me finish, she said. She turned to the last page she'd filled in. At the bottom, double underlined, was a number. $163,000. I read it twice, then a third time because the first two times my brain simply refused to process it as real. My eyes went to Dot's face, and she looked back at me steadily, without apology, without softness, the way a doctor looks at you when they need you to understand something important, and they don't have the luxury of cushioning it. That can't be right, I said. It is right, she said. I checked it 4 times. Over how long? 3 years. Starting the month after the wedding. I pressed both hands flat on the table. The wood felt very solid under my palms, and I was grateful for that. Dot, some of that is money we gave them. Not loaned. Gave. I know, she said. It's all in there. Every category is labeled. She reached across and turned several pages back, pointing to the column headers she'd written at the top of each section. Gifts. Loans requested. Expenses covered without being asked. Services rendered. She had broken it down like a forensic accountant. I sat with the number for a long time. $163,000. I had worked for 36 years as a licensed plumber in Columbus, Ohio. I knew exactly what that number represented in hours. In early mornings. In winter, crawl spaces and August attics, and jobs that ran 6 hours past when they were supposed to end. There's something else, Dot said. She reached into the back cover of the notebook and pulled out a separate sheet of paper folded once. She set it in front of me and smoothed it flat with her palm. It was a bank statement. Not ours, not the paper one we got in the mail each month. This was a printed transaction history, the kind you pull from online banking going back 18 months. And running down the right side of the page were withdrawals I did not recognize. Small ones mostly between $80 and $300 at a time, occurring at irregular intervals, never on the same day. Never in a pattern obvious enough to catch on a casual glance. These aren't yours, Dot said, pointing to a cluster of them near the middle of the page. I checked everyone against your receipts and your memory and mine. These don't match any bill we pay, any grocery run, anything. My stomach dropped somewhere below the chair. How did he get into the account? I said. But even as I said it, I already knew. The evening in the fall of 2022. Travis at my kitchen table with my phone patient and Thorough walking me through the banking app, the linked family access feature he'd added without making a production of it. The app, I said. The app, Dot confirmed. He could see the balance. He could initiate transfers. The amounts he took were small enough that the bank's fraud detection never flagged them. Their system is looking for large, unusual transactions, not a series of small ones spread over 18 months. She looked at me carefully. He knew our deposit schedule, Gary. The pension hits on the 3rd, Social Security on the 2nd Wednesday. Almost every one of these withdrawals happens within 2 days of a deposit. The room felt smaller than it had been a minute ago. I looked at the transaction history, and I thought about my son sitting at my kitchen table 2 years ago, his voice patient and helpful, telling me he just wanted to make sure I was safe from scammers. I had thanked him. How much, I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the number. From the account, directly just over 19,000, Dot said. On top of the 163, I put my elbows on the table and pressed my face into my hands, and sat like that for a while, breathing. I could hear the refrigerator running. I could hear a car go past outside. The world was conducting itself normally at a considerable distance from my kitchen table. Dot put her hand on my forearm. Not rubbing, not patting. Just there. Steady. The way she's been steady for 43 years. The way she was steady the night Mason was in the hospital. The way she was steady every time I wasn't. "I'm sorry," I said into my hands. My voice came out rough and wrong. "I should have listened to you sooner. You told me twice and I didn't listen." "Gary," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it was firm. "Look at me." I lifted my head. Her eyes were dry and clear and direct. "We are not going to spend time on that right now," she said. "What we are going to do is figure out what comes next. But first I need you to understand something." She took her hand off my arm and straightened in her chair. "This is not a family problem anymore. The moment we realized money had been taken without our permission, it became something different. We needed to stop treating it like a family misunderstanding and start finding out exactly what happened." I looked at my wife across our kitchen table. This woman who had kept a composition notebook for 3 years without saying a word. This woman who had watched me make excuse after excuse and had written down every number anyway quietly in her careful handwriting, waiting for the moment I was ready to look. "Okay," I said. And this time I was the one saying it. "What do we do?" She reached back into the notebook's cover and pulled out one more sheet of paper. A name and a phone number written in the same careful hand. "We made a call," she said. The name on the paper was Ray Kowalski. I'd known Ray for 30 years. We met on a job site in 1994. He was doing the electrical, I was doing the plumbing. And we spent 3 weeks working around each other in the same half-finished commercial building on Morse Road, which is how you either become friends with someone or develop a permanent professional rivalry. With Ray, it became friendship. He retired 4 years ago after a long career managing commercial lending at a regional bank, and he still had the sharpest financial mind of anyone I knew outside of my own wife. I called him that afternoon. He picked up on the second ring, heard my voice, and said, "Gary, what's wrong?" That's the thing about old friends. They can tell in 4 syllables. We met at a diner on Cleveland Avenue the next morning, a place we'd been going since our kids were in school. The kind of place where the coffee comes in those heavy ceramic mugs and the booths have vinyl seats that crack along the seams in cold weather. I brought everything Dot had put together. The notebook, the transaction history, the labeled columns, the running total. Ray read through it without speaking. He was a man who had spent decades reading financial documents, and he moved through Dot's materials the way a surgeon moves through an X-ray, not quickly, not slowly, but with complete attention and no wasted motion. When he finished, he set the last page down and looked at me over the top of his reading glasses. "There's something else," I said. "Dot found something last night after I called you." I reached into the folder and pulled out the last document. It was a loan application, 2 of them actually from 2 different consumer lending companies. Both were printed on company letterhead, both were filled out in a neat, unfamiliar hand, and both bore a signature at the bottom that was not quite mine. I set them on the table between us and watched Ray's face. He picked up the first one, read it through, picked up the second. His expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes shifted in a way that told me everything I needed to know about how serious this was. "Total," he said. "41,500, I said. "Between the 2. Ray set the applications down and took off his reading glasses and laid them on the table beside the papers. He looked at me for a moment without speaking, which from Ray was its own kind of answer. "That's not your signature," he said. "No." "You're certain?" Dot caught it before I did, I said. She pointed to the G. My G has a small hook at the bottom, has since I was in school, just the way I write it. These don't. Whoever wrote them got everything else close enough that you'd need to look twice, but they missed the hook. Ray nodded slowly. 28 years reading numbers, he said. Of course she caught it. Travis filled out paperwork in front of me twice when they bought the house, I said. I signed things at the table while he sat right there. He would have seen my signature dozens of times. He practiced, Ray said. It wasn't a question. He said it the flat, factual way you state something that has already been established beyond argument. The word sat on the table between us like a physical object. Practiced. My son had sat somewhere I didn't know, where didn't want to picture it, and practiced writing my name until he could do it well enough to put it on a loan application. He had applied for $41,500 in my name and directed the payments and correspondence to himself, knowing I never opened financial mail from unfamiliar senders because I assumed it was advertising. In Ohio, Ray told me what Travis had done with that signature fell under the state's forgery statute, a felony, the severity depending on the dollar amount involved. $41,000 put it squarely in serious territory. Combined with the pattern of unauthorized transfers from the linked bank account, Ray said this was no longer a family disagreement about boundaries. This was elder financial exploitation under Ohio law, a separate charge that carried its own significant penalties specifically because the victim was over 65. You need to talk to someone in elder law, Ray said. Today, if possible. Not tomorrow. What do we do in the meantime? I asked. Ray folded his hands on the table. He had the manner of a man who has delivered difficult news before and has learned that the most useful thing you can do is be direct and calm. You close that bank account, he said. Open a new one at a different institution entirely. Today, Gary, not this week, today. Move your pension direct deposit and your Social Security to the new account. Leave the old one open with a small balance. And do not tell Travis you've done any of it. Wow. Why leave anything in the old account? Because an empty account tells him immediately that you know, Ray said. A small balance looks like an oversight. It buys you time and, more importantly, it lets you control when and where he finds out. He picked up his coffee mug. The moment he discovers the money isn't where he expects it, he's going to react. You want that reaction to happen on your terms, not his. I drove home that afternoon with Ray's words running on a loop in my head. Dot was waiting at the kitchen table. I sat down and told her everything Ray had said, and when I finished, she was already standing up and reaching for her coat. I'll go to the bank now, she said. You stay here. Dot. Gary. She looked at me with those clear, direct eyes. I have been keeping that notebook for 3 years. Let me finish what I started. She was back in 2 hours. New account open transfers, redirected old account sitting with $96 in it, enough to look like an oversight, not enough to matter. I sat in my kitchen and looked at the folder on the table. The notebook, the transaction history, the loan applications with the signatures that weren't mine. And I understood for the first time that what I had built my whole life to protect had been taken from me slowly and carefully and with great patience by someone I had taught to shake a man's hand and look him in the eye. I sat with that for a long time before I could stand up and move around again. There is a specific kind of pain that comes from knowing something you cannot unknow. It doesn't announce itself loudly. It doesn't arrive like a punch or a fall. It settles in slow and thorough, the way cold settles into a house when the furnace goes out at night. By the time you fully feel it, it has already been there for hours. That was the week after Ray's diner. I went through the motions. I made coffee in the morning. I read the paper. I went to the hardware stores on Tuesday because we needed weather stripping for the back door, and I stood in the aisle for 6 minutes, holding two different brands without being able to decide between them, which has never happened to me in my life. I am a man who makes decisions about hardware. I put one back and bought the other, and drove home and sat in the truck in the driveway for a while before going inside. Dot watched me doing all of this without comment. She had her own way of processing things she cleaned. Not the regular kind of cleaning, but the deep kind, the kind where she pulls everything out of a cabinet and wipes down the shelves and puts it all back in better order than it was before. By Thursday, every cabinet in our kitchen had been reorganized. By Friday, she'd done the hall closet too. I understood what she was doing. When Dot cannot fix the thing that is broken, she fixes everything around it. On Saturday morning, Travis called. I stared at his name on the phone screen for 4 rings before I answered. "Hey, Dad," he said, bright and easy, the voice of a man with nothing on his conscience. "Just checking in. How's the knee been?" "I don't have a bad knee. Dot does." He'd mixed us up, or he hadn't been paying close enough attention to remember which one of us had the bad joint. Either way, I noticed it. "Fine," I said. "Everything's fine." "Good, good. Hey, I was going to bring Mason by tomorrow afternoon if that works. He's been asking about you." My chest did something complicated at the mention of Mason's name. I said tomorrow worked fine. I said we'd see them then. I hung up and stood in the kitchen and looked at the back door with the new weather stripping I'd installed that morning. And I thought about a boy who used to ask me about pipe fittings, and I thought about a loan application with my name on it in someone else's handwriting. And I thought that it was possible to hold two completely opposite things in your chest at the same time and have both of them be completely true. When Travis and Kristen brought Mason over Sunday afternoon, I sat on the floor with that boy for an hour and built a Lego set he'd brought in his backpack. A fire station. He was meticulous about it, checking each piece against the instructions before placing it, which he'd gotten from Dot, that particular patience that need to have it right before you commit. I watched him concentrate and felt something in my throat that I had to swallow down carefully. Travis sat on the couch and talked about a co-worker situation I couldn't follow. Kristen was on her phone most of the time. When they left, Mason hugged me around the middle and said, "See you next time, Grandpa." And I held him a beat longer than usual and said, "You bet, buddy." After they left, Dot and I sat at the kitchen table and didn't talk for a while in the way that is not actually silence, but two people thinking through the same problem from different angles. Then Dot said, "We have to stop Gary. The transfers. All of it. We can't keep going." "I know," I said. Ray said the longer we continue, the more it looks like we consented to all of it. Every dollar we send after knowing what we know makes it harder to prove we didn't authorize everything. "I know," I said again. She looked at me carefully. "But," I pressed my palms flat on the table. "But Mason has nothing to do with this. He's 8 years old, and he didn't choose any of it. Whatever Travis and Kristen have done, he's still our grandson, and he still needs Gary." Dot's voice was gentle but absolute, the way it gets when she has already thought the thing through completely and arrived at the place she needs me to reach on my own. Continuing to send money to Travis and Kristen does not protect Mason. It funds the situation he's living in. Those are different things. I sat with that. It was true. I knew it was true the moment she said it. It was still one of the hardest truths I'd ever had to hold. "When," I said. "Chumpity, Dot said. "We stop Monday. No call, no explanation, no warning." Ray was clear about that. The moment they know we know everything that can be moved or destroyed gets moved or destroyed. We give them nothing to work with. And when they come to us, Dot reached across the table and put her hand over mine. Her hand was warm and dry and steady, the same hand I'd held at that laundromat on the night we met, the same hand I'd held in the hospital when Mason was sick, the same hand that had quietly filled a composition notebook for 3 years while I looked the other way. When they come to us, she said, we'll be ready. I turned my hand over and held hers back. We sat like that for a while, 2 people in their late 60s at a kitchen table in Columbus, Ohio, about to do the hardest thing either of us had ever done as parents. There is a thing they don't tell you about being a father. They tell you about the labor of it, the early years, the school years, the letting go. They talk about sacrifice and pride and watching your child become someone. What they don't tell you is that the love doesn't stop when the behavior does. It doesn't pause. It doesn't recalibrate itself based on new information. It just keeps going full strength even when the person you love has done something that has broken something in you that you're not sure can be repaired. I loved my son that night. I loved him the next morning when I did not make the transfer. I loved him through all 4 days that followed. That is the part that doesn't fit neatly anywhere in a story like this. But it is the truest part, and I would be lying to you if I left it out. Monday came. I made coffee. I sat down. I did not open the banking app. I put my hands around the mug, and I waited to see what kind of man my son was going to show me he was. I want to tell you about those 4 days, because nobody ever talks about this part, the waiting. Everyone wants to know about the confrontation the moment things broke open, the part with the door. But the 4 days before that are the part that cost me the most, and I think they deserve to be said plainly. Monday passed without a word from Travis. I checked the old account, twice the one with $96 sitting in it, like bait on a hook, and the balance sat unchanged. I made dinner. Dot and I watched television. I went to bed at 10 and lay there looking at the ceiling for an hour before I fell asleep. Tuesday morning at 9:47, my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. A text from Travis. I read it standing up, my coffee mug in my other hand. Hey Dad, I think you forgot to do the transfer this week. No big deal, just whenever you get a chance. Casual. Easy. The tone of a man reminding his father about something routine and minor like taking out the recycling. I set the phone face down on the counter and finished my coffee. I did not respond. Dot came into the kitchen 20 minutes later, saw the phone face down and looked at me. I told her what it said. She poured her coffee, sat down at the table, opened the newspaper to the crossword and said, "Good." Just that single word without looking up from the page. Good. By Tuesday afternoon, Travis had sent a follow-up. Dad, seriously, we've got bills due this week. Can you do it today? The casual tone was still there, but something underneath it had tightened like a string being wound one turn too many. I read it, put the phone down, went out to the garage and organized a shelf that didn't need organizing. Wednesday morning brought a text from Kristen to Dot's phone. Dot read it to me at breakfast. Her voice completely neutral, the way she reads the news. Hey Mom, just wanted to check in. Mason needs new shoes for school, his current ones are getting tight. If you guys could help out this week, that would be amazing. Love you. Dot set her phone on the table and picked up her fork and continued eating her eggs. She signed it, "Love you," I said. She did, Dot said. She has never once said "love you" to either of us in person. No, Dot agreed. She hasn't. We finished breakfast. I washed the dishes, Dot dried them and put them away, and neither of us said anything more about it, because there wasn't anything more to say. Wednesday evening was the hardest. Travis called, not a text this time, an actual call, and I watched his name light up on my screen, and I felt my hand move toward it before I stopped myself. I let it go to voicemail. He didn't leave one. 30 minutes later, Kristen called Dot's phone. Dot let it go to voicemail too. Kristen left a message that Dot played for me afterward, her voice smooth and warm and completely constructed. "Hey Dot, it's Kristen just calling to check in. We haven't heard from you guys in a few days, and we just want to make sure everything's okay. Gary, if you're listening, Travis is a little worried about you. Give us a call when you get a chance. We love you both." I stood in the kitchen and listened to that message, and felt something cold move through my chest that had nothing to do with the November air coming under the back door. She was good. I'll give her that. She was very, very good. Thursday morning, my cell phone rang at 8:15. I looked at the screen and my heart seized in my chest so hard I had to grip the counter edge. It was Mason's number. I picked it up before I could think about it too carefully. His voice came through small and a little uncertain, the way it gets when he's been coached on what to say, but isn't entirely sure he's saying it right. "Grandpa, it's me. I miss you. Can we come over soon?" I closed my eyes. The back of my throat burned the way it does before tears come, and I swallowed against it hard. "I miss you too, buddy," I said. My voice held barely. "I miss you a lot. Mommy said you've been busy," he said. "Yeah," I said. "I have been pretty busy." "Okay," he said. Then quieter, like he was reading from something. "Mommy says to tell Grandpa that everything will be okay if Grandpa just calls Daddy." The burn in my throat turned to something harder. I stood in my kitchen holding the phone with both hands, now my knuckles going white around it, and I breathed through my nose. And I did not say the thing that rose up in me, because the person on the other end of the line was 8 years old, and none of this was his fault, and he was being used like a tool by the people who were supposed to protect him from exactly this kind of thing. "You tell your mommy I got the message, buddy," I said. "You be good, okay? I love you." "Love you, Grandpa." I ended the call. I set the phone on the counter with both hands because one hand alone wasn't steady enough. Dot was standing in the doorway between the kitchen and the hall, and her face was doing something I hadn't seen it do in a long time. Not quite crying, but close enough that you could see the effort it was taking her not to. "She used him," I said. My voice came out rough and scraped down to the bone. "She put words in his mouth and used him like a—" "I know," Dot said. Her voice cracked on the second word, and she pressed her lips together hard and breathed through it. "I know she did." I turned around and looked out the kitchen window at the backyard, at the maple tree I'd planted the year Travis was born, its branches bare now in November, skeletal against the gray Ohio sky. I stood there and I breathed, and I did not fall apart, because Dot was still in the room and one of us had to hold. "Tomorrow," Dot said from behind me. Her voice had steadied. "It'll be tomorrow, Gary. I can feel it." I kept looking at that bare maple tree. 42 years old. I'd planted it when Travis was a newborn, thinking someday my son would climb it. "I know," I said. "I know it will." Friday came in cold and gray, the kind of November morning in Columbus where the sky sits low and flat like a lid pressed down over everything. I was on my second cup of coffee at the kitchen counter at 6:43 when I heard it. Not a knock. I want to be precise about that because it ended up mattering in ways I couldn't have predicted. 3 hard impacts against the front door with something flat and heavy, then a fourth, and the whole frame shuddered in its casing in a way no human fist produces. I knew that sound. I'd hung that door myself in 2009, spent a whole Saturday fitting it square in the frame. I knew exactly what it took to make it shake like that. I set my mug down. Moved to the front window first, the one beside the door that lets you see the porch without being seen. Travis was out there, his face dark and tight, his jaw set hard. Behind him on the front walk, halfway between the porch and the sidewalk, Kristen stood with both arms rigid at her sides, her whole body vibrating with something that had been building for 4 days and had finally found its direction. In his right hand, Travis was holding a hatchet, the kind you buy at any hardware store in Ohio for splitting kindling. Short handle, single blade, common as a hammer. And he was using it against the door of the house where I had lived for 31 years. I heard Dot's footsteps in the hallway behind me. She appeared at my shoulder, looked through the window, and her hand found my arm and gripped it hard enough that I felt her fingernails through my flannel sleeve. "Sheriff," she said. Her voice was low and absolutely controlled. "Don't open that door." "I have to," I said. "Not yet," she said. "Give me 30 seconds." I heard her move quickly back down the hall. The door shook again under another impact, and Travis's voice came through the wood, loud and raw and cracking at the edges. "Open the door, Dad. I know you're in there. Open it right now." Dot came back to my side. She had her phone in her hand, the camera app open, pointed at the front of the house through the window. "Okay," she said quietly. "Now." I opened the door. Travis came through before I could say a word, his shoulder catching the frame, his body moving with the forward momentum of a man who has been working himself up to this for 4 days. He stopped in the middle of our living room and spun around, and his eyes were bloodshot and wild, the eyes of someone who hasn't slept properly in days and has spent the deficit in anger. "Where is it?" he demanded, his voice breaking on the last word. "What did you do with it, The account has nothing in it, Dad. Nothing." "Travis, don't." He pointed at me with his free hand, the one not holding the hatchet, and his finger was shaking. "Don't you say my name like that. You had no right. That money keeps our lights on. That money pays for Mason's school supplies and his doctor appointments and his—" "Travis." Dot's voice came from behind me, clear and precise and completely without tremor. "Put that down. Right now. Put it on the floor and step back." He looked at her. Something in Dot's voice, that particular register she gets when she has gone past patience into something quieter and more absolute, made him look at the hatchet in his hand like he'd briefly forgotten it was there. He lowered it to his side but did not put it down. Kristen had come in behind him. She moved past both of us toward the kitchen, and I heard the sound that has stayed with me longer than any other from that morning. The sound of my wife's kitchen drawers being opened and rifled through by someone looking for a bank statement, a card, anything that might tell them where the money had gone. Dot has kept those drawers in the same arrangement since we redid the kitchen in 2003. I know every sound they make. I heard the junk drawer stick and then heard Kristen force it, and something in me went very still and very cold. "You destroyed us," Kristen said from the kitchen, her voice high and sharp, stripped of the warm, constructed tone she'd used on the voicemail. "We had a life. We had a plan. And you just decided to pull the ground out from under us without even a phone call, without one word." "Kristen." My voice stayed level. I had been practicing that for 4 days. "Come out of my wife's kitchen." She appeared in the doorway. Her face flushed, her eyes bright with fury. "You owe us an explanation. You owe us at minimum that." "We don't owe you anything," Dot said. And then she said the thing I will remember for the rest of my life, in the same quiet voice she'd used all morning. "You were reachable, Kristen. Our account was reachable. That is not the same as yours." Kristen's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Travis crossed the room in 4 steps and grabbed both my shoulders and pushed me back against the wall hard enough that the coat hooks rattled and one of my wife's jackets fell to the floor. His face was 8 inches from mine, close enough that I could see the broken capillaries in his eyes, close enough to smell the stress sweat on him. "You are going to call the bank?" he said through his teeth, his voice dropping to something low and pressurized and more frightening than shouting. "You are going to call them right now and put it back. Every dollar. Today. There is a row of coat hooks on that wall. 4 of them. I put them up in 1994, same summer Travis started Little League. The second one from the left has a small, dark mark beneath it, about the size of a thumbprint, from years of a small boy hanging his backpack, in the same spot every single afternoon after school. That mark is still there. It has never come out, no matter what Dot has cleaned it with. My son had me pinned against that wall, and I was 8 inches from his face, and I was looking past his ear at that thumbprint mark. I did not move. I did not lift a hand. Because I knew what was mounted above the front door, the doorbell camera I'd installed on Tuesday, the one Dot had confirmed was running before I opened the door, and I knew that the moment I raised a hand, this became something a defense attorney could call mutual and walk away from. So I stood still. I looked at that small, dark mark on my wall, and I stood absolutely still, and I let my son hold his father against a wall in his father's own house. And I want to be honest with you. It was the most humiliating 30 seconds of my adult life, and I would do it again tomorrow without hesitation. Dot said from 6 feet away, in a voice like a woman reading a weather report, "Travis, the doorbell camera above the door has been recording since Tuesday morning. 11 seconds. I counted them later on the file when Officer Briggs asked me to pull it up. 11 seconds of complete stillness in that room, Travis's hands on my shoulders, nobody moving, the only sound the refrigerator running in the kitchen. Then Travis turned his head and looked at the transom above the door. He saw the small black lens looking back at him. His hands came off my shoulders like I'd gone electric, and he stumbled back 2 full steps, his face cycling through disbelief and calculation, and something that looked just for a moment like the face of a boy who has been caught doing something he knew was wrong. Kristen said, her voice gone thin and uncertain. "You recorded us in your own home. That's illegal. Ohio law permits homeowners to record on their own property," Dot said, "including the front entrance." Outside, a neighbor had already called 911. Officer Sandra Briggs, a 16-year veteran of the Columbus Police Department, who handled domestic disturbance calls with the practiced efficiency of someone who has seen every version of this situation, arrived in 6 minutes. She took one look at the hatchet on the floor where Travis had finally set it, one look at the damage to the front door, and one look at Travis and Kristen, and she made her assessment quickly and professionally. They put Travis in handcuffs first. He didn't fight it. The fight had gone out of him the moment he saw the camera. Kristen argued the whole time Officer Briggs was securing her wrists, her voice rising through 3 different explanations. They were provoked. Gary had promised financial support. This was a family matter that didn't require police involvement. Officer Briggs wrote it all down without comment, and Mason was on the sidewalk. Alone. 8 years old in his school shoes, standing on the frost-white concrete, watching 2 police officers put his parents into the back of a patrol car. His face was not the face of a child who was crying. It was worse than that. It was the face of a child who had gone somewhere far inside himself, because what was happening on the outside was too large to process. I walked out there. My knees were unsteady on the porch steps, and I gripped the railing going down. I crossed the front walk, and I got down on both knees on that cold sidewalk, and I put my arms around Mason, and he came into them without a sound, his whole small body rigid, his fists clenching in the fabric of my jacket. We stayed like that until Officer Briggs came and crouched down beside us and said gently, "Sir, when you're ready." Officer Briggs drove us to the station herself. Not in the back, she put us in the front. And me, which I understood later, was a small, deliberate kindness from a woman who had correctly read the situation in about 90 seconds on our front walk. Travis and Kristen went in a separate car. I watched that car pull away from the curb, and I felt something leave my body that I am not sure has fully come back. At the station, a detective named Howell took our statement in a small room with a table and 4 chairs and a whiteboard on the wall with someone else's case still written on it in blue marker. He was maybe 50, methodical, the kind of man who writes everything down in the same unhurried way regardless of what he's being told. I appreciated that. It meant I could say things at the pace I needed to say them. Dot had brought the folder. Of course she had. She'd gone back for it before we left the house, picked it up from the kitchen table where it had been sitting since the night Ray told us what to do, and tucked it under her arm like it was her purse. When Detective Howell asked if we had documentation, she set it on the table and opened it and explained the organization, the notebook, the transaction history, from the linked account, the 2 loan applications with the forged signatures. And Howell looked at it the way Ray had looked at it, with the quiet attention of a professional encountering work that has been done correctly. He asked Dot how long it had taken her to compile. 3 years of notes, she said. About 2 weeks to organize it into what you're looking at. Howell picked up one of the loan applications and studied the signature at the bottom. Then he looked at me. "Mr. Sutton, is this your signature?" "No," I said. "You're certain?" "My wife can explain the specific difference," I said. "She caught it before I did." Dot pointed to the G. Howell nodded slowly. He set the application back down and made a note. In the next room, separated from us by a wall and a closed door, Travis and Kristen were giving their version of events to a different officer. We couldn't hear words, but I could hear the rhythms, Kristen's voice going in long, fluid sentences, the kind that sound like explanations, and Travis's voice, shorter, punctuated the voice of a man trying to find his footing. Howell told us what the charges would likely be. Criminal mischief in the 1st degree for the damage to the door in Ohio. That charge applies when property damage is caused deliberately. Using a tool or instrument and a hatchet used against a residential door qualifies without ambiguity. Elder financial exploitation under Ohio Revised Code, Section 2913.02, which applies specifically when the victim is 65 or older and the financial harm exceeds a certain threshold, and our threshold had been exceeded many times over. And forgery under Section 2913.31, a felony whose severity is determined by the dollar amount on the fraudulent document. $41,500 put that squarely in felony territory. Howell said these were serious charges. He said the district attorney's office would determine how to proceed. He said we would be contacted. We drove home in our own car in the late afternoon, the sun already going down behind the houses on our street, the way it does in November, fast and without ceremony. The front door was damaged along the top hinge where Travis had worked at it with the hatchet. I looked at it when we pulled into the driveway. I would need to replace it. I had the tools. I knew how to hang a door. I went inside and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, and Dot sat across from me, and we were quiet together for a while, in the way that is not emptiness, but 2 people who have said everything that needs to be said, and are now simply present with each other. After a while, Dot reached across the table and put her hand over mine and kept it there. The following week, we met with an attorney, a woman named Patricia Sayers, who specialized in elder law and financial exploitation cases in Franklin County. She reviewed Dot's documentation for 40 minutes without speaking, occasionally making a small mark in the margin of her notepad. Then she looked up and said, "Mrs. Sutton, I want to ask you something. Did you keep this record because you suspected something was wrong, or because you always keep records like this, Dot considered it. Both, she said. By the end, both. Patricia Sayers nodded, like that was the right answer. She walked us through what the legal process would look like, the charges, the likely trajectory toward a plea agreement, given the weight of documentation, the restitution order that would be part of any plea deal. Under Ohio law, a plea agreement in a forgery and elder exploitation case typically includes full restitution of amounts directly proven as fraudulent, meaning the forged loan amounts of $41,500 were recoverable with certainty. The additional amounts, the transfers through the linked account, the cash Gary had given willingly over 3 years, these required more nuance to recover. But the pattern of behavior documented in Dot's notebook, combined with the exploitation charge, gave them grounds to negotiate for a substantial portion. I signed the engagement letter with a pen from Patricia Sayers's desk. My G had the hook at the bottom. It always has. 9 days after the incident, on a Thursday afternoon, I was in the garage when I heard a knock at the front door. A real knock this time. Quiet, almost hesitant. I came around the side of the house and found Linda Marsh standing on the porch, her coat buttoned to the top, her hands clasped in front of her, looking like a woman who has rehearsed something and is no longer sure it was enough. "Gary," she said. Her voice was unsteady. "I have been trying to find the right time to come over for a week and a half." She stopped. Her chin trembled once, and she pressed her lips together hard. "I sat in that woman's kitchen, and I listened to things about you and Dot that I should have known better than to believe. You have been my neighbor for 22 years, and I never once asked you for your side of it." Her eyes filled up. "I'm so sorry. I am truly, deeply sorry." I looked at this woman who had brought us a casserole when Dot's knee went bad, who had waved to me across that street every single morning for 2 decades, and I felt the anger I'd been carrying toward her drain away so completely and so quickly it left me almost lightheaded. "Come inside, Linda," I said. Dot just made coffee. She pressed both hands over her mouth and nodded, and her shoulders dropped about 2 inches with relief. I held the damaged front door open for her, and she came in, and from the kitchen I heard Dot say, "Linda, sit down. I'll get you a cup," in the same warm, uncomplicated voice she has used with the people she loves for 43 years. I stood in the hallway for a moment after they went in. I looked at the damaged frame, the splintered wood along the top hinge. It was a fixable thing. I had fixed worse with less. I went to the garage and got my tools. The hearing was on a Tuesday morning in March. Judge Caroline Merritt's courtroom on the 4th floor of the Franklin County Common Pleas building was smaller than I expected. 14 rows of benches, most of them empty. A clerk at a side desk. The Ohio state seal on the wall behind the bench, blue and gold, the kind of thing you stop seeing after a while, because it's always there. Dot wore her navy blazer, the one she saves for occasions that require her to be her most composed self. She has worn it to 2 retirement ceremonies, 1 funeral, and now this. Travis came in from a side door with his attorney. I had not seen him since the morning on the porch, and the change in him hit me in the chest before I had time to prepare for it. He had lost weight, real weight, the kind that takes months and doesn't come from trying. His suit jacket hung loose at the shoulders. There was gray at his temples that had not been there in November, and his face had a drawn quality, like something had been pulled tight underneath the skin and hadn't been released. He did not look at us when he came in. Kristen entered separately, her own attorney beside her. She had accepted a plea to a lesser charge, complicity and criminal mischief, while Travis carried the elder financial exploitation and forgery counts. She looked exactly as she always had. Composed, put together, her expression arranged into something neutral and appropriate for the setting. She glanced at us once when she sat down the way you glance at a thing you have categorized and filed, and no longer need to think about. The judge entered, and we rose and sat, and the proceedings began with the efficient, unhurried pace of a system that has done this 10,000 times and will do it 10,000 more. When the time came for the allocution, the formal statement of facts that Travis was required to deliver as part of his plea agreement in his own words on the record. In open court, he stood up and picked up a single sheet of paper from the table in front of him. Under Ohio's plea structure, an allocution requires the defendant to acknowledge specifically and without qualification the facts of the offense. Not an apology. Not an expression of remorse. A statement of what happened said out loud, where a judge and a court reporter and anyone in the gallery can hear it. Travis's hands were shaking badly enough that he had to lay the paper flat on the table to read it. He said that, beginning in the fall of 2022, he used a linked access feature on his parents' bank account, a feature he had added under the pretense of helping them with online banking to make unauthorized transfers totaling over $19,000. He said the transfers were timed to coincide with his parents' pension and Social Security deposit schedule. He said he applied for 2 personal loans totaling $41,500, using his father's name and a signature he had written himself. He said he had practiced that signature. He said it out loud in that quiet courtroom with the court reporter's fingers moving on her keys. He had practiced his father's signature. He stopped reading for a moment. His throat worked. He picked up the paper again. He said that on the morning of November 15th, he went to his parents' home with a hatchet and damaged the front door. He said he put his hands on his father in his father's own house. Judge Merritt asked if there was anything further. Travis looked up from the paper. For the first time since he had walked in, he looked directly at us. His eyes found mine and stayed there, and I saw something in them that I had not expected. Not defiance, not calculation, but something raw and exhausted and ashamed that looked just for a moment like the face of the boy who used to fall asleep in the truck on the way home from job sites. I told myself every single month it was the last one, he said. His voice broke completely on the last word, and he pressed his lips together and looked back down at the table. Judge Merritt looked at him over the top of her reading glasses. Her voice was measured and without cruelty. "Mr. Sutton," she said, "in 22 years on this bench, that sentence is the one I hear most consistently from defendants in financial exploitation cases. And it is precisely that sentence told to oneself month after month that is the mechanism by which $300 becomes $41,000. The sentence is not an explanation. It is the description of the problem." She gave him the terms: felony conviction on the elder exploitation and forgery counts, 3 years of supervised probation, full restitution of the forged loan amounts, $41,500, plus a negotiated restitution of $62,000 representing the documented unauthorized transfers and a portion of the pattern of financial exploitation payable on a structured schedule over 6 years. Mandatory financial counseling. A no-contact order with Gary and Dorothy Sutton for the duration of probation, except through legal counsel. Kristen received 18 months of unsupervised probation and a separate restitution order for the criminal mischief damages to the door. In the hallway afterward, Travis's attorney guided him toward us, and Travis took 2 steps in our direction before the attorney caught his arm and reminded him of the order. He stopped. He stood about 10 feet away with his hands at his sides, his suit jacket still hanging loose at the shoulders, and he looked at us with the particular helplessness of a man who has run out of moves. Dot looked at him for a long moment. Then she said clearly and without wavering, "Travis, we love you." She paused. "And we are not going to see you for a while." She took my arm and we walked to the elevator. I did not say one word to my son in that hallway. I have turned that over more times than I can count in the months since, whether that was strength or whether the tank was simply empty. I still don't have a clean answer. What I know is that Dot got a sentence out, and I got nothing, and that in 43 years of marriage she has consistently been able to do the thing I cannot, and I have learned to be grateful for it rather than ashamed. That was March. It is October now. Kristen moved out of the Hilliard house in April and relocated to another city to stay with family. Back in February, the week we stopped the transfers, Dot had said it quietly at the kitchen table one evening that Kristen would be gone within a year of the money stopping. She was off by 2 months. Mason is living with his grandmother Carol, which is not an arrangement anyone would have chosen, but which is at least stable. He calls me on Sunday afternoons sometimes, just to talk, just to tell me about school and the frog habitat his class is building, and a boy named Derek, who is sometimes his friend and sometimes not, the way friendships go at 8 years old. I sit in my chair by the window, and I listen to every word. The restitution payments come on the 1st of every month. They have not been late once. Dot and I still have coffee on the back porch in the evenings when the weather allows. The maple tree is bare again now, the way it gets every October, its branches against the gray Ohio sky. 42 years old, that tree. I planted it the year Travis was born, thinking someday my son would climb it. He did climb it actually when he was 7 or 8, got stuck about halfway up, and hollered for me until I came and talked him down one branch at a time. I hung the new front door myself a Saturday in late November, the week after the incident. Dot stood in the doorway watching me work the way she always has her coffee in both hands, and when I finished and tested the swing and the latch, she said, "Looks good, Gary." And I laughed. A real laugh, the first one in a long time, the kind that comes up from somewhere lower than the chest, and it surprised me so much I had to set down the level. "Yeah," I said. "It does. I spent 36 years fixing things that were broken. I knew how to read a situation, find the fault, and make it right. What I did not know, what it took all of this to teach me, is that some things you cannot fix by working harder or staying longer or giving more. Some things you can only fix by finally, after too long, putting your tools down. The door is new. The house is quiet. We are all right. People ask me if I have regrets. I tell them the truth. I regret every year I spent making excuses instead of paying attention. I regret that it took a broken door and a courtroom to make me see what Dot had been showing me for 3 years. But I do not regret loving my son. I never will. Here is what I want to say to anyone who recognizes themselves in this story. If someone in your life keeps taking and you keep giving because you love them too much to stop, I understand that. I lived it for 3 years. But love without limits is not generosity. It is permission. And the cruelest thing I did for my son was make it too easy for him to become someone I no longer recognized. Do not be like me. Do not wait until the door is broken to finally read what was written on the wall. I am not a religious man by habit, but I prayed in that hospital hallway when Mason was 3 years old, and I pray now that my son finds his way back to being the boy who asked me about pipe fittings on Saturday mornings. I do not know if he will. I know the door is new. I know the house is quiet. And I know that some things like forgiveness take longer than 6 years to pay back. This is a grandpastries moment I never wanted to share, but I believe someone needed to hear it. This is my family revenge story, not of hatred, but of finally choosing dignity. If this revenge story reached you, if it made you think of someone in your life, leave a comment below. Share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. To everyone who stayed until the end, thank you from the bottom of my heart. One more thing before you go: some stories on this channel contain fictional elements built with the purpose of education and reflection. If that is not for you, no hard feelings, step away and find content that serves you better. But if you are still here, I am glad you stayed.